I was asked to cover a couple of the more arcane, sort of wonky items this evening, especially those that pertain to the establishment of Point Reyes National Seashore and by extension, the northern district of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, which also has grazing. And then I was also asked to kind of discuss a little bit about the leases that the ranchers have currently, the designation of the ranching districts, and the 2016 lawsuit, which was sort of spearheaded by my organization in partnership with the Center for Biological Diversity and Western Watersheds Project. And then kind of get to current issues. We've been talking about that a lot, so I'll sort of keep that part short because it's really, I think the enabling legislation, the ranch lease history are some of the most arcane issues, and it's something that elected officials and agricultural proponents alike both point to when advocating their position for the preservation of ranching at Point Reyes. This is, the enabling legislation that created the National Park Service. It's often referred to the Organic Act or the National Park Service Organic Act or the NPS Act. But it was established in 1916. And as you can see from the quote, it's to conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects and the wildlife therein, and to provide for the enjoyment of the same in such a manner and by such means as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. And so there are a couple key things to call out here. The first is the order. And there are various interpretations of whether or not that order is intentional. I think everything in enabling legislation is absolutely intentional. There's a reason why so many politicians have a background in law. And it's because in that profession, as well as in the development of policy, words matter. And so the natural and historic objects, I think there's a couple pieces that are bundled up in that can be unpacked about, not just natural resource preservation, but that those things should not be impaired by historic objects, and that's why that comes next. But the other thing is this unimpairment clause, and that is like a huge piece of why people harken back to the Organic Act. And it's something that comes up time and time again when we talk about Point Reyes National Seashore and the proposed plans by the National Park Service. If they're expanding or extending commercial agricultural uses on the seashore, and we know that there are negative environmental impacts to those operations, is the National Park Service and the Department of the Interior, which the Park Service falls under, are they truly following the Organic Act? Are they leaving these resources, both the historic objects, but also the natural resources and the wildlife therein, unimpaired for future generations? And in my first presentation, when I discussed everything from the elk to birds, et cetera, as well as Laura's previous presentations as well, where she's gone into some of that, the biotic communities, it's clear that there are long-standing negative impacts that might have impaired these resources for far longer than anyone has intended. And so it's something that we constantly have to revisit, but it's something that this next general management plan amendment also is, they have to hold that up against this enabling legislation for the National Park Service. Of course, this was from my first presentation. Another slide. This is the actual enabling legislation for Point Reyes National Seashore to save and preserve for the purposes of public recreation benefit and inspiration a portion of the diminishing seashore of the United States that remains undeveloped. There are some questions about even if the ranching continues at the seashore, in order to mitigate methane emissions, which make up over 60% of the greenhouse gas emissions of Point Reyes National Seashore, if they put in anaerobic digesters, if they create new loafing barns to mitigate some of the runoff, is that in line with this this enabling legislation, what remains undeveloped, or is it part of this, encroachment that is just, cumulative over time, whittling away at the undeveloped pieces of the National Seashore. And this was the bill signing. You see all the way to the right is David Brower, and then right next to, who is the first executive director of the Sierra Club. And then you have right next to John F. Kennedy, Clem Miller, who unfortunately passed away shortly after the enabling legislation was signed, establishing Point Reyes. And I should also note that the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, while years later it was established after 1962, it also has similar language as the Point Reyes legislation that we can look to as far as acquisition and what uses can take place within the legislative boundary. So this piece is actually an extension of what I had just shared. So this is the next statute within the enabling legislation. It's all about acquisition of property. And I wanted to point to two things in particular, because these are, something that you should just let marinate and should think about, because it's important. It gets back to what I said earlier. There's a reason why they're lawyers. Words matter. The placement of words matter. What is left out is also telling. But you look at this first line: the secretary is authorized to acquire, and it is the intent of Congress that he shall acquire as rapidly as appropriated funds become available. So that's the first thing that I just want folks to notice, because it'll become important when I show you this next slide. So you'll see it's actually word for word called out. The secretary is authorized to acquire, and it is the intent of Congress. It is actually spelt out in this first statute about the acquisition of property. Furthermore, you look down at the second underlined section. The secretary is authorized to pay for any acquisitions which he makes by purchase under these sections of this title, their fair market value. So that's just something we hear a lot, and we just want to make sure that we call that out, because that's actually in there. They were paid fair market value. Those lands were appraised, and it's something that you can point to directly in the second statute within the enabling legislation. And we also, if anyone wants the deeds, we actually have copies of all the deeds. Some of them are difficult to read based on the way they were scanned, but a lot of them are very clear, and it'll show you exactly the amount of acreage, who had the land in their ownership, and who transferred the title and the deed to the National Park Service, and sort of what the language and the stipulations were. Actually, most of those deeds are just the geographic dimensions of each of the parcels. So that's what makes up the body of the deeds for the most part. But sorry, aside from that, this is the next section that is very important for our discussion. This is the actual statute that dictates what happens after the ranchers that were ranching in 1962, what happens after they sell their land for fair market value to the National Park Service and the federal government. So the first thing is the owner's reservation of right of use and occupancy, RUO, you'll see. Sometimes you'll see ROP as an acronym, and if you read any other bits and pieces about this. But RUO is what we'll work with as an acronym. And this is for another thing you'll see here: fixed term of years or life. Again, specific language, which is telling, right? It's not that they didn't leave that out, but that they actually called out fixed term. Furthermore, in that second starred section that's underlined, you'll see it says, the owner of the improved property or of agricultural property on the date of its acquisition by the secretary under these sections of this title may, as a condition of such acquisition, retain for himself and his or her heirs, and assigns the right of use and occupancy for a definite term of not more than 25 years, or in lieu of, therefore, for the term ending at the death of the owner or the death of his or her spouse, whichever is later. So this is another thing that, when I consistently review this after getting pushback from folks, just have to make sure that these things are called out, right? I double underlined that definite term. Again, just like fixed term above, these are words that mean something. They're not just thrown in there willy-nilly. They were actually discussed and they were put in here for a reason. And so definite term of not more than 25 years, that should indicate something to folks, that there was a plan of some sort to revisit this discussion at another point in time. And I'll get into that in a little bit. But then beneath that, jump down to the next underlined section. A right retained pursuant to this section shall be subject to termination by the secretary upon his or her determination that it is being exercised in a manner inconsistent with the purposes of the other sections of this enabling legislation, which include things like the impairment clauses, right? Like if there are natural resource preservation issues, if there's a need for interpretation, if there are other cultural resources, for instance, excavation sites, archaeological resources from the coastal Miwok that lived within this boundary long before Europeans came over to take it from them. If that exists, the secretary has the discretion to remove those lands from ranching. Just calling this out, and this is also updated over time, but the final thing I call out here is, where appropriate, in the discretion of the secretary, he or she may lease federally owned land or any interest therein, which has been acquired by the secretary under those sections and which was agricultural land prior to acquisition. Prior to, I believe it's 1959. But this is important as well, because you see in other sections, there is the use of shall, which is a very strong word, a very strong directive. And here you see may, which is a looser term, which provides the secretary with more flexibility and more discretion in determining when and where those leases might be made for the allowance of grazing practices at Point Reyes National Seashore. The other thing that's very clear in here, unlike the previous slide, you'll note that it doesn't say in here that it doesn't call out congressional intent. It does not say that there was congressional intent for the ranching to continue indefinitely. It does not say that there is congressional intent for it to continue for as long as the heirs wanted it to. You see that in the first statute, and in this statute, you'll see other strong language like fixed terms, definite terms, he or she may lease, instead of shall be subject to termination. So these are just some of the ways that I like to call out sections in order to make sure that people can better interpret some of the legalese that you see in enabling legislation. So I hope that's helpful, and I hope that folks, if they have questions, we can talk about that more in depth. This is more, I just wanted to discuss something. I was originally going to do a chronology of how we got from a fixed term, 25 years, all the way to discussions right now about 20-year leases, and then they're going to be rolling at the end of 15 years so they can just continue them onward and onward and onward and onward. And now they're talking about different succession planning beyond the heirs to other folks that might want to ranch as well. So you might all be familiar with this map as well as this slide. This is a photo I took when I first started working on this project. This is from El Ranch, which you'll see up here. And it's actually owned by or it's leased by, I should say, a rancher that also leases a number of his family leases a couple other ranches out here, actually. But this is one of the most heavily impacted areas of Point Reyes, I'd say. So most ranchers, as they negotiated the sale you saw that they retained these rights of use and occupancy. And a lot of those expired around the year 1991, or in two cases, 2005. And I believe that there are two ranches that are at the southern point of Point Reyes, actually down here. And that would be the Nyman Ranch and the Percy Ranch. Those are life estates. So those are different than the other ones. The other ranchers decided to take that fixed term 25-year lease. And these agreements are all reflected in those original deeds and titles that I had previously mentioned. So when the ranchers' reservations of use and occupancy began expiring in the 1990s, the park once again redefined the legal status of the ranchers. And they decided that they would shift them from these reservations of use and occupancy over to special use permits, which were 5-year permits. And there were a number of reasons that they say they have done this in the administrative record. One of them was as new regulations came on board, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, et cetera, they decided they would need to move into different types of leases in order to better enforce some of the laws on the books from the federal government. So that's one rationale that I've seen in some of the texts. The problem is that even although the individual ranchers had these 5-year leases, the long-term future of ranching at Point Reyes was still in many respects ill-defined. And this is called out in an administrative history published by the Park Service in 2007, which is written by Paul Sadin. And that's also on the Restore Point Reyes website under studies. And currently what they do under the current way that they go about it, if a rancher decides that they don't want to continue or they can't continue, like what happened at D Ranch, the family wasn't able to continue, they decide that they will work with the ranchers around them. Instead of restoring that land, they will offer those leases to another operator, which is the current case with D Ranch. There's 3 different pastures that are leased now to 2 separate families, I believe from E and C Ranch. So, originally the park wasn't going to include all of these ranches, and they recognized the need to do that. But in the congressional testimonies, you can get a better sense of where people were coming out. Some folks were, staunchly in support of, long-term ranching, and others saw the leaseback structure, at least that 25 years, as a sort of negotiating tactic with the ranchers. They could acquire all of these parcels. They can lease the land back to them for 25 years. And in some cases, for that 25-year period, they wouldn't require the ranchers to pay any of the leases. And so that could dramatically bring down the cost of acquisition, and they could use that $57.5 million fund for Point Reyes to do other things like, building a facility at Drake's Beach, refurbishing Bear Valley to make it the headquarters, et cetera. So during that 25 years, it's my understanding from publications from the Park Service, many of these ranches that were under these reservations of use and occupancy, actually, they weren't paying for rent or anything. It was just part of the agreement, and that was just another negotiating tactic. The Park Service has also used that tactic elsewhere. And I mentioned that some of the statements in the enabling legislation had changed over time. Just wanted to call that out. In 1970, just looking at my note here, in the congressional record, they added language that allowed the Secretary of the Interior to authorize ranching permits in the pastoral zone until the Secretary determines that such use is incompatible with the purpose which the seashore was established. Additionally, the legislation adding lands to the seashore in 1978 and 1980 encouraged the continuation of existing agricultural uses on the land to be acquired. And the 1980 legislation, however, also included language giving the Secretary authority to disallow agricultural use when the land needed to be used for resource management or interpretive purposes. So it's actually quite similar to what I'd showed y'all in the previous slide. I think the distinction is they were still purchasing parcels from the Trust for Public Land, from AT&T, and from other interested parties that had ownership of the title and deeds for some of the parcels out in the within the legislative boundary. So they just continuously updated and made sure that for every time they had new acquisition, they were able to say, the secretary has the authority to do various things with those parcels. And I think one of the things that's really important to call out here too, and worth the time, is that on April 11th, 1983, the Department of the Interior correspondence from the National Park Service director of the Western region, his name was Howard Chapman, he sent a memo regarding ranching permits to the superintendent of Point Reyes National Seashore, John Sansing. And apparently, in a previous memo, John Sansing had asked the director of the Western region of the National Park Service what the plan was regarding the continuation of ranching activities within the pastoral zone once those reservations of use and occupancy had expired. In his reply to Superintendent Sansing, Mr. Chapman stated they planned to continue ranching activities once the reservations of use and occupancy expired. At the time, his rationale was that there was legislative intent that ranchers should be permitted to continue their traditional agricultural operations until the secretary finds that these operations are incompatible with the purposes for which the seashore was authorized, and that the National Park Service had a record in managing the ranching activities within the seashore that was a strong indicator of their future intentions. So apparently, things were going okay with the ranchers. It wasn't extremely problematic. It's also worth noting that they'd only just created their first general management plan in 1980. Most of the water quality studies, most of the grazing studies, the actual best management practices for ranching, none of that had been created yet. None of that had been studied yet. So at that time, there weren't many reasons that they could point to. There weren't many things that they could say, this is definitely going to impair resources for future generations. And so at that time, they decided to move them into special use permits, as I alluded to prior. And so, yeah, that's something that I just wanted to call out. There are a couple more pieces of that history, but I think those are the important things. It's just acknowledging as they expanded, they continued to give the secretary authority to terminate those leases should there be some reason that they were going against, or the ranching was going against the purposes for which the seashore was established. And also there were internal memos sent from on high that said, things are going okay. There are new laws on the books. Maybe we can, clean up these lease agreements, create special use permits, and see where it goes from there. The special use permits were only 5-year permits, and so it allowed the National Park Service to maintain the ranching while also leaving the door open to revisiting the discussion every 5 years should new studies come out that show that the ranching was, or the dairying was, not in line with the purposes for which the seashore was established, or not in line with the Organic Act, etc. Some of those things in these new lease agreements and these new special use permits, one of them, this is something I compiled when I first began working on the case out here, but within the codes, within their lease agreements, they're 10 to 15 page agreements, and didn't want to get too deep into the wonkiness of it, but I wanted to acknowledge a couple things. One is treatment of livestock management of refuse and carcasses. So diseased, injured, or dying animals shall be treated promptly in accordance with customary veterinary practices, and dead animals are expected to be removed. We've seen photos of coyotes, other animals with cattle carcasses in their mouths. We know that the burying of cattle carcasses also perpetuates the unnatural overpopulation of ravens at the seashore, which has a negative impact on a number of migratory as well as local birds. And the next one is that leases of the land are subject to the right of the National Park Service to establish trails, roads, and other improvements and betterments over, upon, or through the premises of those former ranches that were privately held. And the leasee understands that occasional park visitors are authorized to walk or hike on various pastures and fields, including in this lease, even though no trail is formally established. So we collectively own Point Reyes National Seashore. We can kind of go wherever we want, as long as we are courteous to the folks that are living within the ranch core. It should be noted that a lot of the fencing, not wildlife friendly fencing, pretty much not park visitor friendly. You're recommended to go through gates and close them when you open them. But we also saw when we started investigating this that there were signs put up that were saying, no hiking, no biking, no walking, no trespassing throughout Point Reyes National Seashore. I've been sent similar signs that have been put up since the pandemic saying, hey, not only is this road closed, because as you know, Point Reyes National Seashore was closed during the pandemic. It recently opened on Monday. But these signs that say, keep our cows healthy, stay off this road, etc. And so it's kind of strange that the Park Service or whoever is putting up these signs is privileging the rights and access of leaseholders for commercial agricultural operations and their livestock over the American people that have the right to, as this code acknowledges, walk or hike on various pastures, fields included in this lease, even if there's no trail formally established. So there were a couple things in the leases. Here's one, the cattle carcasses and refuse that's not removed, and internal documents from the Park Service had shown that there are bone pits scattered throughout the park. If you go to that, the beautiful cypress tunnel, it's actually a good place to find a ton of cow bones. Kevin Lunny with G Ranch, on his property, I found numerous carcasses. And I've seen photos of other carcasses that are buried throughout the park. I've seen tributaries or drainages into Drake's Estero that have had cattle carcasses in them. And that has been documented as well. So those are a couple lease clauses that are known to be broken. A couple other ones that we know have also been broken are animal units. So every ranch has an amount of what are called animal units or animal unit months that are essentially how they adjust stocking rates for livestock, not just in national parks, but on all public lands. It's understanding the carrying capacity of the landscape. We've also received, through FOIA Freedom of Information Act requests, documents that say, hey, the range manager, the range tech that works for Point Reyes did a spot check. We don't know how frequently they do that, but did a spot check and found that this was overstocked. This ranch was overstocked. This ranch was overstocked. This ranch had animals that it wasn't even allowed to have on its lease. So that's something that we can look to within the leases, the current leases, I should say, as far as whether or not those things are being followed. Furthermore, it mentions RDM. You'll see down below, the acronym is residual dry matter. This refers to the amount of forage plant material remaining on the range. Laura might have covered that in her last lecture on native plants and the non-native plants that exist out there and are perpetuated by ranching and that encroach on native plant communities and relative coastal prairies. But this is another item. During the drought, 2012 through 2014, they did some checks on those ranches and they found that about a third of the ranches out there were overgrazed. They all failed. About a third failed residual dry matter analyses. And this was published by the Park Service, I believe, in 2015. It might be on the Restore Point Reyes website. I believe it is. And if you don't find it, you can reach out to me to look at that. And it's just that, these are a couple things on the books. On the leases, the water quality stuff is more vague because it defers to the total maximum daily load allocations from the Regional Water Quality Control Board and the State Water Quality Control Board. But these are just some of the things within the leases that we know are chronically broken and not enforced appropriately. There are draft leases that came out with this draft management plan that's currently underway, and they've updated things. And so if you'd like to find those, you might find them on the Park Service website. If you can't, feel free to reach out to me. I have them. I'm happy to send them to everyone. I could actually just send them to John, Diane, to share. And, then I'm going to jump into this is the ranching district piece. There was a question that I received prior to this for this presentation. When did that happen? Why did that happen? This had been in the works for quite some time. There are two ranching districts, historic ranching districts on the, I only use quotes because that's what they're called, but they are historic ranching districts. They were added and listed to the National Register of Historic Places in October of 2018 for the one at Point Reyes, which is on the right-hand side there. And then there's a smaller Olema Valley Dairy Ranching Historic District between Bolinas and Point Reyes Station. That was formerly listed before the Point Reyes one that was done in April of 2018. This wasn't jammed through in the last minute by any means. This had been worked on by the National Park Service for quite some time. As I mentioned, the Organic Act does call out historic objects, historic places, cultural resources as a charge for the National Park Service to preserve those things. And so they actually hired a local historian, some of you may know him, Dewey Livingston, who has written numerous publications for the Park Service, but all of those publications were integral for the establishment of these as historic districts. And so it just captures a lot of the information for other government officials, for the National Park Service. In the future, should they need to repair a barn or need to figure out what were the exact windows that, like the styles and things like that. It's very much focused on the objects, less so on the ranching. In our comments during this last comment period, Resource Renewal Institute acknowledged that I believe there are like 7 criteria for cultural resource preservation. The continued actual presence, commercial use of ranching in a historic ranching district is but one of 7. So you look at other historic ranching districts, Grand Tetons National Park, Channel Islands National Park. They all have historic ranching districts, and yet there's not any sort of large or medium scale commercial ranching or dairying within those historic ranching districts. The one at Channel Island, most notably, was also those cultural resources in that district. A lot of those resources were sort of cultivated or captured by Dewey Livingston as well. So there's plenty more on that. I didn't want to get too deep in the weeds on this item, but just to acknowledge that there are 2. It's been in the works for quite some time. It's part of the charge for the National Park Service to identify these types of historic places for the register. And it's also, in my personal professional opinion, it's not the most significant piece. And by it, I mean ranching. Ranching is not the most significant piece of what makes these cultural, historic objects and resources, especially when we look around the rest of the national park system. Another thing that was asked, I know I'm long on time here, but was hoping to take up that 30 minutes. Resource Renewal Institute versus National Park Service was filed in the Ninth Circuit in February of 2016. I think you'll see what February 10th, 2016. Asked three things. It wasn't against the ranchers. It was against the National Park Service, and it wasn't necessarily about the impacts of the ranching, but it was about the process that the Park Service took to continue the leases, those 20-year leases. They spent about $1 million between 1999 and 2010 or so working on a general management plan, which under the Administrative Procedures Act, they are required to do every 10 to 20 years, because all kinds of things change around national parks, not just within national parks. Here in California, drought is the new normal. And that's something that wasn't captured in the 1980 general management plan for Point Reyes in the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. But there are other things. Climate change wasn't captured. The reintroduction of the Tule elk was an idea, but the actual large-scale implementation, the creation of a second herd outside of Tamales Point, the Pierce Point Ranch area, that wasn't really called out in the 1980 plan. So within the park, there are a number of changes that happen. And outside, there are all kinds of economic changes that happen as well. New visitation, new development, et cetera. And so that is why the Administrative Procedures Act requires the Park Service to come up with plans every 10 to 20 years. 10 years if things are moving rapidly, like glacier melt or something, and 20 years if things are not moving as rapidly. Well, when they embarked on their general management plan, it was totally in line. At about 20 years, they decided to start it. Unfortunately, due to the Drake's Bay oyster controversy, the Secretary of the Interior at the time, Secretary Salazar, directed the Park Service to pursue 20-year leases. It didn't say give them 20-year leases. It said look into it. Pursue this as a goal, or as something that you all should be looking into, spending time and resources on. Well, what happened is that actually just shelved this $1 million general management plan that they started in 1999, 2000. And so they then embarked on this special plan, this Ranch Comprehensive Management Plan, that was all about just extending 20-year leases. And it didn't require a significant environmental analysis. They didn't require an environmental impact statement like the current plan does. And so what we recognized is they shelved $1 million plan to pursue this new plan and sort of, kind of do this pivot away from allowing the American people to look at all alternatives for the future of Point Reyes National Seashore based on a directive from the Secretary of the Interior, which is, it's not a law, it's not binding, it's just a directive from their boss, essentially, who is also an appointed rancher. So our lawsuit under the Administrative Procedures Act, filed in federal court, asked the court to require the Park Service to do a couple things, to follow the National Park Service Act, the Organic Act, which I mentioned, follow NEPA, and the Point Reyes Act, the enabling legislation for Point Reyes. In doing so, it asked the agency to prepare an environmental impact statement, the first one that was ever conducted for Point Reyes National Seashore, particularly for ranching. And that's kind of crazy that by shelving that original plan, the general plan they were operating under at Point Reyes was like 38 years old. And not only did it not include any of those other things I had previously mentioned, environmental impacts, climatic impacts, but it also didn't include any environmental impact statement or analysis for the ranching at Point Reyes. So that was imperative for us to make sure that was in this, that's something that came out of this litigation. And the final thing was this was through the Administrative Procedures Act, we requested the Park Service prepare an updated general management plan to provide for the preservation and use of the seashore based on current conditions before they did any of these special plans that locked in ranching for 20 years or started to, give them, dozens or hundreds of acres for row crop production or for chickens or goats or sheep or Airbnbs. And so those were the three main things that were embedded within the litigation that was filed. We entered settlement agreements in October of the same year, extremely swift, I'd say. And I think part of that is because this was just handled so poorly by the Park Service. And they were in a bind because they're getting pressure from the ranchers who were worried about their fate after the Drake's Bay oyster battle. And then they were also, directed by the higher ups at the Department of the Interior. And then they still, they had a whole other plan, but then it seemed like they needed to shift gears. So it didn't help that Dianne Feinstein or Jared Huffman or the previous Congresswoman before Jared Huffman all put pressure on the Park Service as well, directing them to take that special plan route. So we sort of, reeled everything back in, like actually doing the reeling hand motion, but we reeled everything back in, and that's the actual planning process that we're in. The final settlement agreement came out in 2017, July of 2017, and it said the Park Service had 4 years to come up with a new general management plan that's updated from their 1980 general management plan. It also included, for the first time ever, an environmental impact statement regarding ranching operations on the seashore. And the other pieces that were part of the settlement agreement were some of the alternatives. It mandated that they had various alternatives they had to provide to the American people, as opposed to just saying, for all the alternatives, there are going to be 20-year leases and just varying degrees of diversification or something. So, we still get, we just were worried that it was just going to be the ranch management plan they were going to do. They just slap general management plan and call it a day. So that's the three alternatives that were required were decreased ranching alternative, a no dairying alternative, and a alternative that ends ranching at the seashore altogether, which is a sunset on the ranching out there. And as I'd mentioned in the previous presentation I had given, here are the first three. You'll see the no action alternative all the way over here. That's what's currently going on. And you'll see the preferred alternative, which is sort of giving them everything, sort of diversification, ranch cores with row crops, changes the succession planning. It technically establishes a population of Tule elk permanently in the Drake's Beach area. And then all the way to the right on my screen right here is essentially alternative B, but they're just going to kill all the elk. And that's the one that various special interest groups from agriculture, some of the ranchers had advocated for in this last comment period. And then the other three, these are the three that were required from that settlement. You see this is the decreased ranching one, phasing out 7,500 acres of ranching. This one would be to phase out dairying and it would allow them to convert to beef operations. And then the final one, it would be the phase out of all ranching permits over a 5-year period. And ranching is discontinued within the planning area. There are a couple caveats to that. There's still 140 acres of historic ranch preservation subzones. And there's another piece that's about the ability for ranchers or for the Park Service to contract with ranchers still for various natural resource preservation uses that could not easily be accomplished with elk. In the short term, maybe. In the long term, I can't speak to that. But that's also language that's included in the current general management plan. I mentioned this succession piece earlier, and I know a lot of people are concerned how long were the ranchers allowed to be there. You see in the original language from the enabling legislation, there are interpretations that allude to the fact that it wasn't always, they always weren't supposed to be there, or there wasn't a plan for them to be there indefinitely. The fact that these different alternatives and alternative B sort of talks about, honoring or extending multi-generational ranching leases, sort of an indication. If that's different than alternative A, which is the no action alternative, that's not the current plan on the books. So it's another indication that the changes to succession are legitimate, and the current plans are still murky, just like it was for the last 50, 60 years. The other thing is alternative A, they would allow ranchers nearby, like they have with D Ranch, to take over leases. But alternative B and C, those would both allow for various extensions of leases, not only to the current ranchers, but to other distant relatives potentially, or maybe ranchers in good standing elsewhere. That is the same case for alternative D and E. It's not applicable for alternative F because there would be an end to the ranching within both of those historic districts, both in the northern district of the GGNRA and within the pastoral zone of Point Reyes. So just important to call out, like they're actively trying to change succession language, which should be another indicator that it's not clear that they intended for ranching to exist there in perpetuity, indefinitely, et cetera. The other thing that also should indicate that that wasn't the plan is that Congressman Huffman's HR 6687 also wanted to propose changing the language to make it clearer, or to actually just put in there in general that they're supposed to be, long-term, multi-generational ranching in perpetuity. I mentioned this on my last presentation, but just as important, would continue to provide an interpretation of Congress's intentions to continue to authorize the ranching and dairying. It directed the Park Service to manage for separation of elk and to actually eliminate the Drake's Beach herd. So when you hear Jared Huffman say, it's so great, this new plan, the proposed alternative, we're going to get a new herd, it's not so great for him because he's been actively trying to eliminate herds of elk within Point Reyes National Seashore. And he also proposed relocation of elk to tribal lands and other types of partnerships. And finally directed the Park Service to issue 20-year leases. It was approved, passed through his subcommittee and the Natural Resources Committee by voice vote, and it also passed through the House very swiftly, stopped in the Senate. The Trump administration signaled support for this. This was back in 2018. But this is a constant concern for us, and why it's important for you all to continue to put pressure on Jared Huffman, to reach out to folks like me, to Laura, to Skylar, to Diana and others, to get the right talking points in order to make sure that, Congressman Huffman can't just get around this issue. He's been actively trying to dismantle some of these important enabling legislation features by adding new language that is very pro-ag, pro-commercial agriculture, and anti-wildlife. This is his actual language that he proposed, underlined sections. You'll see, we talked earlier about the difference between may or shall, and some of what the power is within that language. You'll see here, the Secretary shall manage agricultural property consistent with Congress's long-standing intent that working dairies and ranches continue. That's not currently in the enabling legislation. There's a reason why he added it, because it's not in there. And then the second underlined section, the Secretary shall manage the tule elk for separation from working ranches or dairies to minimize conflicts and prevent establishment of new elk herds on agricultural property. It may work to, remove them, relocate them, work with other agencies as they see fit. And so, lots of shall language. And then again, he calls out what Secretary Salazar had stated in 2014, directs the Park Service to complete without delay the General Management Plan amendment. But then he says upon completion, issue leases and special use permits of 20 years for working dairies and ranches on agricultural property, which was a direct confrontation with NEPA, with the actual National Environmental Policy Act, which required them to look at all of the alternatives. And of those alternatives, they all didn't include 20-year leases. So this is something that's troubling, that may rear its head again, but we remain vigilant and attentive to Jared Huffman and Dianne Feinstein's intentions and the lobbying efforts of people like Kevin Lunny, who was recently on stage with Donald Trump talking about how the Park Service out here and local folks out here are trying to remove all the ranches and how they need help. Happy to send around that media information, and Donald Trump and Kevin Lunny of G Ranch shaking hands as well. It is a project of the Resource Renewal Institute. A lot of the work that me and some of the other good folks are doing is volunteer work. I mean, it's night and day, just trying to do it, but welcome any support that any of the folks on the line have that allow me to dedicate more time in my work plans to do this, that'll allow Resource Renewal Institute to remain open so that we can continue working on this and update the Restore Point Reyes Seashore website, which we're currently in the development of, with new research that we're continuously doing, 9 to 9 every day. So thank you very much. Look forward to talking with y'all.